Buckle up, buttercups. Rex Bear League Project, how the heck are you? Now, did you know there was a recent full lunar eclipse, Blood Moon, and the date was incredible. 3/3/2026. It starts at 3:33 a.m. and that's some incredible synchronicity right there. What is not quite as incredible, I guess you could say frightening, is the military strikes that took place during that time. And if you follow the star charts, if you follow astrology, it seems like a lot of major events take place at specific times connected to eclipses and particular planetary alignments. And we've got Mark Lerner with us from Great Bear Enterprises. Mark's got over 40 years research and experience and working with astrology and numerology as well as the tarot. And Mark's got a great story. He shared it with us before. His parents wanted him to be a doctor, and he said, well, how about a doctor of the stars? So great to see you, Mark. Also, ladies and gentlemen,
thank you.
Thank you. Check out the website, iconicastrology.com, for daily iconic astrology charts, as well as greatbearenterprises.com. You can also pick up 2 different tarot decks at greatbearenterprises.com. We'll show those here in a little bit. But let's get into it. Before we do, real quick, I want to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, which is boomerboost.com. If you go to Gladiator, or if you go to boomerboost.com and you order the Gladiator barley and the Boomer Boost combo and you use the code REX20, you'll get 20% off your order. You set it up for auto ship, you get an extra 10% off. They also have amazing collagen and cutting edge nutrition at their website, boomerboost.com. Some people think they should change the name to Gen X Boost. But hey, Mark, let's jump right in. How are you doing?
I'm well, like you were explaining, and as everyone knows, this is like one of the more rapid, I hate to use a word like this, rapid fire information things. We know our current president does things like often spur of the moment, intuitively or whatever. He's a transactional type person. He's different than other presidents. He was never really a party person. I mean, he was independent. He's an outsider. We could talk a little bit about that. He's got a very unique chart. I've said on the show before, I'm a quasi-historian. I should have gotten, when my daughter, who does a lot of my website work, is incredible stuff that she's doing. When she was born, I was in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I took the GREs. I was 31. I'd already started astrology 9 years before, when I was 22. We've explained, instead of going to medical school and becoming a doctor. First day of taking a chemistry class at Columbia University after I'd already graduated from Michigan State, and I thought I could still take all these classes. Come back to Forest Hills, Queens. I was born in the same borough as our current president. Like, he's just down the road. I mean, he's 4 years older, but like when I hear him talk about stuff, probably went to the same restaurants. You know what I mean? And not far. It's an unusual thing to be aware of somebody. I mean, I've had a lot of unusual connections. My magazine, Welcome to Planet Earth, actually went to the Clinton White House back in the 90s. Did that for 20 years. And George Stephanopoulos, who's now on ABC all these years, was the Clinton chief of staff. And we were sending our magazine. You'll show maybe those symbols later. For 20 years, I did something called Welcome to Planet Earth. And whether or not Clinton ever saw it, I have no idea. But George Stephanopoulos, I don't have the proof anymore, but he would write me back and just say, like, people were saying Time Magazine, Newsweek, whatever it was. And I was doing Welcome to Planet Earth, which was a new whole thing in the field of astrology. And I would get a couple letters saying, hey, keep going, thanks. Al Gore, as vice president, was also into this stuff. And I would get a note from him every so often, thanks, you know what I mean? Now, it was just maybe a courtesy, but we can talk a little bit more about that. Oh yeah, thanks so much. I selected 12, there was 3 of these that I pulled all my magazines for over 20 years. We had a great group of astrologers. You've told people before, there's 2 astrologies, okay? There's personal astrology. We all have our birth charts. Most people, if you're even into it, it's like, I don't know anything about it, or I know I'm a sun sign this, and that's it. Like 99% of our planet, of 7 to 8 billion people would be like, I don't believe in it. I think my sun sign is this. And I've done this for like 50 years. You know what I mean? So it is a very unusual thing, but I was thankfully able to be a publisher and had great astrologers, what we call mundane or earth or world astrologers. So when a president is inaugurated, when a king, comes into power, when somebody dies, when there's like Three-Eye Atlas comet appears suddenly, any major event, you know what I mean, that happens, is a birthing moment, just like each one of us has a birth chart. And when we study that, if you get into it, it's like, I took my first breath on a certain month, day, and year, at a certain time, in a certain place, a longitude and latitude. Then what you learn is you're more than your sun sign. You have a moon, you have a Mercury or Venus. This is just the bare bones. And if people go to Great Bear Enterprise, my main website, you go to the top and there's an area like, it'll just say about, ABOUT. And if somebody clicks on about, you'll scroll down and you'll see what is astrology. And if somebody clicks on that, they'll see something I wrote ages ago called star language. And I wrote this basic, what are the houses? What are the signs? What are the planets? What is the sun and moon? And I gave an example of John F. Kennedy's birth chart so that people would see what a chart was all about. I just chose somebody who, was a significant person in my life. And okay, now what you're seeing here is the first crusade. Okay, we got to talk about this in a couple of minutes, because this whole thing that we're seeing now, and that's why I feel grateful to you for all of these times that we do it, seriously, because only actually, I just did this morning because I have a colleague from Welcome to Planet Earth, and I'm not in touch with a lot of the people. That ended it. It went from 1981 to 2000. It's now 2026. People have passed on. They're living in different places. They're not doing the same thing. And we had dozens of astrologers all writing about world events and metaphysics, UFOs. I mean, all the stuff that you present, we were writing about all this. And you and I have shared about that. So years ago, when the Persian Gulf Wars began, and we could talk about that. This is what I call Persian Gulf War 3 at this point, because what we had, let's just be clear, and I will not ever give out a wrong fact that would be like in several almanacs, okay? You know what I mean? Well, if I say anything on the show, somebody can go to the original World Almanac from 1868. There's a particular one. It's not Information Please. It's the original one. And in there are all these historical dates. But fundamentally, let's be clear. So what we had with first President Bush, if you remember, what happened was Saddam Hussein seized Kuwait, And when he seized Kuwait, which we had supported Saddam Hussein, people don't even remember this. There was a 7-year war between Iraq and Iran. Look it up, folks. I'm not lying.
Right. That's
the Shias and the Sunnis were fighting each other. And, look, all of this is so much. When the original Ayatollah, not the one who was just killed, the Ayatollah Khomeini, came back on February 1 of 1979. I know this is kind of like, how does he remember this? This is my world. He was in exile. The Shah of Iran, who had been replaced after our CIA overthrew the elected leader in Iran in 1953. You can look all this up. There are dozens of books on it. We didn't want somebody, that what we weren't used to, like that was Islamic. So what we did was we installed the Shah, which was part of a whole, basically the kingly energy that had been going on for decades in what we call Iran, which had used to be Persia. And so the Shah was replaced, this person, and ruled from 1953 to the end of 1978. And then he developed cancer. And Jimmy Carter said, okay, the Shah, you can come to New York City and be treated for cancer. And that happened. And while that happened, in France, the Ayatollah Khomeini, the original one, who was in exile because the Shah didn't want the country to be Islamic, didn't want it to be a theocracy. It was being ruled by basically a military junta or whatever the Shah was. So the Shah is now dying in New York. And these dates are accurate because I was 29 years old when all this was happening. So on February 1 of 79, the original Ayatollah comes and comes into Iran from France. And everyone is like, oh my God, you know what I mean? All of the faithful of the Shia world. And then 10 days later, the prime minister that had been, he was named Bakhtiar, okay, was still functioning under the Shah, but the country was in revolt. And what happened that morning, which was a very powerful time, and there was a full moon, this is February 11, 1979, the military in Iran aligned themselves with the Islamic forces of the Ayatollah. The prime minister resigned, and that's actually the chart I use, what I call for revolutionary Iran. From that moment to now, from February 11 of 79, the Islamic Revolution in Iran has been in power. So now, between America and Israel, we just killed the second Ayatollah, who had been in power for 37 years, from 1980, whatever it was, 1988 or 19, whatever the year was. But the original Ayatollah was 1979. And the other thing to remember that people forget is during that first year was when our hostages were taken in the American embassy under Jimmy Carter. In November 4th, whatever it was, 55 of our members were taken over. There was a student revolution. And that's what led to President Reagan coming into power. They were taken for 444 days. And it was this big loss at the end of the Jimmy Carter administration. And when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th of 1981, after 444 days, Jimmy Carter went to the airport in Washington, D.C., and received those 55 hostages. They kept our hostages for 444 days. And this is what brought about, actually, just so you know, when we hear breaking news, that phrase came from that time period. You know what I mean? Because of our hostages being taken by student revolutionaries in the American embassy. You know, so that's the history part of it. Then we fast forward. So under George Bush, okay, the first, Saddam Hussein, after fighting from Iraq against Iran for 7 years, he decided to seize Kuwait for oil and so on. And he did that because he thought America would not do anything. He was allied with us. He was a Sunni, right? As terrible as he was. So he seized Kuwait, and immediately the first George Bush said, literally, this will not stand. It was in the New York Times, and he got the United Nations, George Bush #1. This is not, George Bush Jr. He got the United Nations to bring together a UN force. This is the days of Colin Powell and other people. And we went in and we freed Kuwait, and they went all the way into Baghdad, but they didn't seize Saddam Hussein because that wasn't the mission. All right. Quick, I'm going to get there very soon here, and then we can talk about all these charts. Okay, but this is important. So what happened was Saddam Hussein stayed in power. Okay. And this is important because Saddam Hussein and Colin Powell are actually born the same month, which is in early April of 1937. Colin Powell was born, and he went to all these different powerful positions with the first George Bush. And then when George Bush Jr. won the presidency, Colin Powell became he was his national security advisor. Okay. In the first Bush, Colin Powell was in the army, and he was like one of the main persons. He wasn't like in the federal government, but he was still in the army and, proving himself and doing, I forget what it was. He was a, high military figure. But with George Bush Jr., part of the way they got to defeat, which was very brilliant strategy, defeat Al Gore and the Democrats, even though Gore had more, popular votes. This was in the year 2000. So George Bush Jr. gathered together in Texas. It was like a week before that election, which, by the way, went to the Supreme Court. 36 days. We didn't know whether Florida was, the hanging chads. I don't,
the hanging chads. That was a mess. That was a mess.
Look, the fact is that Florida on all networks was declared for Gore. The Republican, George Bush's chief of staff, called Jeb Bush, who was this is a fact, the governor of California, and said, you have done a great disservice, because when all the votes are going to count, you'll see that, Bush will win. And literally what happened on all three networks was when the check mark went to Gore on TV, everyone knew now Gore is going to become president because he got Florida. And so they made an important call. This, I was watching this whole thing, and if you were a Democrat, you
I
were
was
like,
watching it too.
okay, so then they call, and all three networks, and then I don't know, I think Fox was in existence, 4 networks, and suddenly we don't know who won it. And then an hour or two later, they give it to Bush. You see what I mean? And remember, when they actually made all the recounting, Bush supposedly won by 536 votes. I still remember that number. And Al Gore, to his credit, after 36 days said, okay. And he made a speech and said, George Bush has won this thing. We can't have this 36-day thing going on anymore. And he is our next president. You know what I mean? And then, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to jump in on that real quick because I was watching that and I was totally into that. And I remember when Florida flipped, I didn't realize it at the time because I was at that time I was pro Bush Jr. I wanted Bush Jr. to make it in.
Right.
My boss was a hardcore Republican. I was selling pool tables at the time and I was young. And anyway, make a long story short, but then my parents were like, well, that's kind of weird that Florida flipped because Jeb Bush is the governor of Florida.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, I didn't want to think about it at the time, but now looking back at it, I'm like,
Well, by the way, okay, this is important. Jupiter and Saturn have been watched for thousands of years. They come together every 20 years. It's part of what we call, they're the 2 largest planets. In the year 2000, in May of 2000, 6 months before that election, Jupiter and Saturn made a conjunction in the sign of Taurus. Okay. So that year was always going to be an upheaval. Part of the reason why Gore and Bush were so close, right? And it came down to the Florida thing. By the way, get this, Gore was from Tennessee, but he lived basically in Washington, D.C. His father, Albert Gore, was the senator from Tennessee. But because he was, this is why, I mean, Gore's chart, Sun opposite Neptune, I told you, Welcome to Planet Earth was sent to Al Gore in the White House in the 1990s, you know what I mean? Well, he was vice president for 8 years. Had he only given me a call, I would have said, look, beware of 2000, Jupiter and Saturn coming together. Your chart is a little bit weird and, and so on. But what happened was basically is that there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the sign of Taurus, which is a very powerful sign, in May of 2000, and then by the fall we had this thing that never happened before, 36 days, the hanging chads. And you may remember the conservative, I'm going to forget his name, for a moment. Okay, well, at any rate, part of the problem in Florida was a lot of people were voting for the conservative candidate. You know what I mean? He was more of a right-wing conservative, and there was a whole thing about like, people were confused where to put the check mark, see, and that was causing a lot of problems. But basically, it was a Supreme Court decision, 5-4, in favor of Bush 36 days later. And Gore said, okay, you know what I mean? I think that would have been fair is like, had Florida just done it all over again, you know what I mean? Just start the vote all over again, you know what I mean? But that didn't happen. And it went to the Supreme Court. And ever since that happened, with the 5-4 decision, the Democrats and Republicans have been fighting, cats and dogs, because Gore did have 500,000 more popular votes. And this has led to the whole thing about popular votes, electoral votes, going to the voting booth, the mail thing, everything that our current president talked about because of what happened in the year 2000, right? Fast forward. Okay, so then we have 9/11, unfortunately, that whole time period, right? And then what happens is that leads to Persian Gulf War II under the younger Bush. And what happens there is that I hope I don't think I'm overstepping my bounds here, but let me put it this way. We know that after that, there was actually under Clinton, when Clinton became president in 1993, was the first bombing in the basement of the World Trade Center. There's an exact time to the second of that. That was right after Bill Clinton was inaugurated in January of 1993. Okay. So it was like February, whatever it was. There was a date in February, which was 8.5 years before 9/11, September 11th of 2001. We already had, you see, from the side of the people who would eventually do the deed in September of 2001, they had already conducted this bombing. So we were already focused on like undermining America. Okay. Nevertheless, Bush comes into power 8 years after Clinton. And then what happens is we wind up, I think it was March 20th of 2003. The Senate agrees, you know what I mean? We need to take out what we thought were what remember this? Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Remember that? And Colin Powell went to the United Nations and gave all these charts. So we went to war against Iraq, and then we were looking for the weapons of mass destruction, and we didn't find them. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know,
Whether they, yeah, go ahead.
I was talking. Sorry to interrupt. I was talking to
No,
a friend of mine that served in Iraq, and he's a Marine. I was talking to him last night about that exactly, and he was very upset because of the, you know, they're like, oh, you're going to war to protect Americans from weapons of mass destruction, and he's like, we never found them.
Well, and here was the other thing. I mean, you know, look, America, like Hollywood, movies, TV, you know what I mean? I hate to bring up the name Osama bin Laden, but when you actually look up in his life, okay, he watched American TV as a kid. His father was a multimillionaire, you know, in Saudi Arabia. That's why he had all this money and all this power after his father died, and there were all these other brothers. When you read the biography, when you read the early life of Osama bin Laden and why he was aligned actually with America in the whole thing in Afghanistan, after the Russians left Afghanistan for 10 years, you know, trying to take over this Islamic country, that's when we went in for 20 years. And Osama bin Laden had been aligned, we don't know exactly what extent, but just like Saddam Hussein had gotten our support, so did Osama bin Laden. You know, because he was fighting, you know, basically he was fighting against communism. You know, he was fighting against the Russians because they had invaded Afghanistan. You see what I mean? It was the Russians who had that 10-year war. So the Islamic radicals were all focused on that. Putin wasn't in there at that particular time. They had, you know, whoever was in there, Brezhnev, you know, we're talking about the Soviet Union. See what I mean? Not modern Russia, who was like that was from 1979, the same year, you see, from 79 to 89. That's when Jimmy Carter, you might remember this, in December of 79 is when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Okay. Osama bin Laden was basically born in 1957. So he would have been 30, well, whatever he was, okay. No, he would have been, 57. He would have been 27 years old, 57, 22. No, he was 22 years old. So as one of the sons of, you know, his father, the millionaire, he became radicalized fighting against the Russians because they were communists. And so that was part of his whole thing for 10 years, fighting with, you know, the Taliban, and they were victorious over the Russians. Then we went in, you see what I mean? And we were in for 20 years, but a little later, you know, we went in. And that was like the last straw for him and whatever he was doing. And then he got all, you know, his military stuff and so on. Meanwhile, what George Bush did is after George Bush Jr., so we went to war against Saddam Hussein. We didn't go to war against the 17 of 19 hijackers, which were from Saudi Arabia. They were our allies, you know what I mean? Because they do not have a theocracy. You know, they have, you know, their Saudi rulership. So we've always been aligned with them, no matter how bad any of their individuals have been. Like Osama bin Laden is Saudi Arabian, you know, those hijackers, if that was the way it was, were Saudi Arabians. But we went to war against Saddam Hussein because George Bush Jr. said he tried to kill my father, and therefore he's a bad guy, and they have weapons of mass destruction, which they could never prove. So March 20th of 2003, I'm pretty sure that's what it was. I'm pretty sure that was it. But after, at any rate, we attack. I remember watching the whole thing, and only a couple of minutes later, do you remember when George Bush Jr. in military uniform on a helicopter landed on an aircraft carrier and said, "Mission accomplished"?
I do not.
Okay, well, he said mission accomplished. Meanwhile, the whole thing in Iraq went on for a couple of decades, which is still uncertain about Iraq. It's not as if it's a stable country. Still, I mean,
right.
We're talking 20 some odd years later. Remember when?
Isn't that crazy?
Well, remember in the first administration of President Trump, they killed Qasim. They killed a military leader of, actually, who was born within one day of Osama bin Laden. He was one of the most fervent, beloved military leaders of Iran. And we went in, he was actually in Baghdad. And at the Baghdad airport, our government basically got rid of Qasim, whatever. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. But I do know when I researched it, he was a time twin within one day of Osama bin Laden. They were born in different countries, you know what I mean? So we have this leader from Iran who is very close to the Ayatollah and their Quds force and all that, was fundamentally murdered, taken out by, an attack on, it was in a car at the Baghdad airport. He happened to be there and our military found out. So that was terrible for Iran because he was a beloved figure in their country. That, just to be clear, if somebody had targeted Colin Powell, right, like from the other side, and murdered him, which never did happen, we would have basically gone to war with whoever had done that. Well, we did that to them, you see what I mean? But they didn't have the capacity to go to war against us, you see what I mean? I mean, Iran didn't, because of Israel and all that. It's just a fact. That's what happened, and that was not that long ago. That was in the first administration of the current president. So those were the two basic Persian Gulf Wars, 1 and 2. After Kuwait, the UN mission by President Bush #1 was very successful. I mean, in terms of a military thing, Saddam Hussein stayed in power, and then so that was 1990 to 1991. And George Bush's after 9/11, and we go in with what was called the Coalition of the Willing. See, that was not a UN mission by Bush Jr. That was, the UN wasn't going to do that, but our Senate basically said, okay, like even Hillary Clinton, all the Democrats said to George Bush Jr., we're with you. 9/11 was so horrific. And if Saddam Hussein has these weapons of mass destruction, even though Osama bin Laden was Saudi, we're going to go and get rid of Saddam Hussein. He's a bad guy. And we got him. And he was hung, you know what I mean? And that was that, you know what I mean? It didn't take that long. I remember, one day on TV, it might've been Bush himself, but it was either Bush or somebody. And they went on TV and said, we got him. And they found Saddam Hussein in his hometown area of Tikrit in one of those holes in the ground in the desert, which was really shocking to anybody thinking that's all he did. He never got out of the country, you know what I mean? To another country, like the recent leader of Syria is now in Moscow, you know what I mean? Bashir al-Assad, you know what I mean? The previous ruler of Syria, who is a tyrant, is living in Moscow with his wife and kids, you know what I mean? In some palace.
Wasn't he ruling for like 20 or 30 years?
Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah, or quite a while, wasn't he?
Okay, so there was his father was Hafiz al-Assad, and what happened was Hafiz al-Assad, the father of this other one, died, and there was an older brother of Bashir. He was killed, and this is another true story. It's amazing. Bashir al-Assad was an eye surgeon living in London, and therefore what happened is the military in Syria called him and said, you're it. Just because you're an eye surgeon, your older brother has been killed. So you're now the ruler, and had to scramble back. And, he's, I forget what their exact tribal name, but there are more sects of Islam in Syria. It's like the country has like dozens, and it's not like Sunni and Shia. See what I mean? Syria is like, 17 or 27 different things of Islam. Everybody's slightly different. It's kind of like Protestantism. If you look, Catholic Church, you know what I mean, is the Catholic Church, basically. But if you look under Protestantism, which comes out of Martin Luther in the 1500s in Germany, and you go to the World Almanac and you're looking for Protestant churches, there's like 193 different, Baptists of this, First Church of Christ Scientists, whatever it is, because
and they're all right. Don't you forget it.
Wait a minute. You got it. No, the thing is, Catholic is right. like Orthodox, like in my family, and so on. I'm born Jewish, and I'm part of a Reform Jewish, and I did go through the bar mitzvah ritual. Anyone who loves Jesus, Jesus was Jewish. He was part of the thing was, according to scripture, he went through bar mitzvah at 13. That's when he disappears. See what I mean? Until he's 33. We don't know exactly where he is. There's all the legends. He went to India. He went to with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea. That's where you get the Holy Grail stuff. We get everything about England and Scotland, and where would the Holy Grail be? All this stuff with the Da Vinci Code, right? The movies, the books.
Yeah.
All of that stuff, it could be Roslin Chapel, in Scotland. It could be under the Louvre. All these things that you probably had people on. You know what I mean? It's fascinating stuff. So at any rate, back to this area. So what has just happened? Yes, there was a blood. What we call. Okay, let me put it this way. If we go back to the Chinese Lunar New Year, let's start there. February 17th, February 18th. Okay, the year of the fire horse, right? You must have gotten into that with somebody else, right? Recently?
No. Let's talk about that too. That's important.
Yeah. So this will help everybody to sort of like get to the blood moon, and then we can go back and forth. Okay. So on February 17th, which was a Tuesday, there was a solar eclipse. Okay. It wasn't, it was what is called an annular solar eclipse. Okay. And what is an annular solar eclipse? So we just had 2 eclipses. The blood moon was a total lunar eclipse, total, okay? Which means that our Earth, the one that just happened March 3rd, the Earth came between the sun and moon, and because it was aligned, this has to do with what are called the nodes of the moon, or what traditionally were called the dragon's head and tail. Every month, every 13 times a year, we have full moons. But every so often, we have a partial eclipse, an annular eclipse where there's a ring of fire. It's not a ring of fire. It's just the sunlight from the sun. The Earth doesn't block that out of the moon so that it looks like there's a ring of fire. That's what happened in the solar eclipse on the day of the Chinese Lunar New Year. That was in the sign of Aquarius. Okay, so that's the fire horse, because in Asia, the birth of their year, which is really fascinating, is not January 1. They also celebrate January 1, but tradition, and going back to the emperors and thousands of years, they have the 12 different, animal signs. Or a rooster. Do you know what yours is? What your Chinese Lunar New Year is, or not?
Snake.
Okay, so I'm a tiger. You know what I mean? And who the people who are like really empowered now are every 12 years there's a different animal, and they have different, instead of our zodiac with fire, earth, air, and water, they add like metal and wood, like 5 or 6 elements. So it becomes more involved, and they have all the stuff with the icons. Look, you're Rex Bear. I'm Great Bear Enterprises. We are connected to the bear totem. May not be our only animal, but it's meaningful, right? There's tradition about what is bear.
Super cool too.
Yeah. What is bear medicine? What is bear energy? Because let's not forget, we're humans, but we are part of the animal kingdom. We're not a plant. Although we do share certain etheric properties with plants, and people tune in. The secret power of plants, people are often magical with their touch with growing plants. People love minerals. We're part of the mineral kingdom too. We have cells, we have tissues, we have organs, we have bones. We take vitamins, right? We need enough iron. You got to have iron, otherwise you have iron poor blood. You need copper for different kinds of things, which come out of seafood, basically clams and shrimp and scallops and fish. You know what I mean? When you study these different elements, and nutrition, magnesium, all these things that we're thinking about to have better health are all part of the world of nature. Minerals and plants, and then the food we eat. Hamburgers, chicken, vegetarian, pescatarian, or whatever we may be. The different things that we do, we're all part of Mother Nature, one way or another.
I'm a Sunarian. Have you heard about that? Where people allegedly just feed off of the sun?
No, yeah, or air. like people who really get into these extreme things and go on diets, or just drinking a lot of water and go on fast. Look, you do what you need to do in order to be as healthy as you can, and this has been true forever. Sometimes I remember when I was in my early 20s and I was living in Queens, but I had my own apartment, and I was getting into all kinds of health things. And growing up, meatballs, turkey, pot roast, all these different things. And I told my mom was somebody who would make some of these things. I said, look, I'm only going to have fish, so she could make fish. And that, I'd go over on a Monday night to where my mother and father were, not far away, when I was living in an apartment. But I was like, I didn't want to eat meat for a while. You see what I mean? And so I went on that little trip, and I look back and I was like, my poor mom. It's like, now it was only fish, but she understood. She understood it. Like, she still liked me to come over, and she made whatever she made. It was just kind of a nice thing. Any rate, so back to the reality. Okay, so this blood moon thing is a full moon total lunar eclipse, and part of the problem in astrology online or anywhere is like, oh my God, the moon is going to turn blood red. You see, now every one of these moons, in order to sort of create a little mystique, like you'll see there's going to be a moon called the snow moon, right? Or the deer moon, or the bear moon. You know what I mean?
Wolf moon.
The wolf moon. Yeah, all these things, which are not wrong. Okay, there's nothing wrong with it. But one part of the thing that just happened because of the attack by Israel and the United States starting on February 28th, and you go, there's no 29th, you get March 1, March 2, and March 3, like you said, at 3:33 a.m., actually the exact time of the total lunar eclipse. When you get an eclipse, it may be a minute or two, a couple of minutes different than the full moon or the new moon, but basically it's all the same. The full moon of the blood red full moon was 3:33 a.m. Pacific time. It was 6:33 a.m. Eastern time. And as you would go into Europe, the local time would change. But the 3:33 was happening because from the West Coast, where there are a lot of astrologers and a lot of promotion on Facebook and X and all these different places, YouTube, whatever, people were picking up on the 3:33 because it was also the third day of March, you see, so the numbers are coming in. But a full moon is the fulfillment of what was started at the new moon. And in this case, what has led to this is that we had an annular solar eclipse, which was over Antarctica on February 17, which was also the beginning in Asia of what is called their new moon. What do you call it? The Lunar New Year. They call it the Lunar New Year. So in
went
China,
over Greenland too. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
The eclipse. It went over Greenland, a huge part of Greenland.
Yeah. So what actually happened was the exact moment of the annular solar eclipse was over Antarctica. But you see, but a solar eclipse is also a new moon. So the new moon of the same day, where the eclipse wasn't necessarily visible, would have been like Greenland, like United States and whatever. And that was the new moon, which is at, and this is part of what happened here. So that was at 29 degrees of Aquarius. And here's what happened. You see, that was on February 17th. But the planet Mars, because of like what you were talking about, the planet Mars reached that spot on February 27th, the day before America and Israel launched the war. On Friday, February 27th, Mars made a square to Uranus in the sky. That re-triggered the eclipse from February 17th. And also Mercury went into retrograde, which happens every 3 months, which I don't necessarily work with that. I created these podcasts about the truth of Mercury retrograde. Mercury retrograde does happen, but it's an illusion. Okay. No planet ever goes backwards. It's an apparent reversal, but appearances are deceiving. So just so everybody knows, all the planets will periodically appear to go retrograde. Jupiter, Saturn, everything, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Neptune, they all go apparently retrograde. But because Mercury does it 3 times in a year, and Mercury rules over communication and transportation and health and information and so on, that has become the poster boy from a lot of modern astrologers, like, watch out, don't do this, don't do that, everything is falling apart with, technology. Now, this is important because this whole war thing, from the standpoint of professional astrologers in general, okay, I'm just giving a generalization, would be like, why on earth did the leader of America and the leader of Israel choose Mercury retrograde, Jupiter retrograde, the largest planet, both of those planets in water signs, which are powerful? Like, Jupiter is actually exalted in the sign it's in now, the sign Cancer. And when my birthday happens on Tuesday, Jupiter will appear to reverse itself again and go forward and be direct. And we'll get into this because Jupiter is going to go into Leo. And a lot of the energies of the first crusade chart, and there's another chart for the beginning of the Muslim era, which goes back, I didn't give you that chart, but there's a chart for July 19, 622 AD, which is sort of when Islam begins. And there's a lot of Leo in that chart, and the sun is in the sign Cancer. This is for Islam. I have the chart. I'm just saying, if people decided they wanted readings or wanted me to send them a chart for that, and something, I would be able to do that, if they're communicating, because I have it on my computer. But the first crusade chart, which I think, were you just showing that or something? I'm not sure if you were showing that.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, so this, folks, just to understand this. Now, again, we'll get back to the blood moon in a moment. But as I was saying, Mars, you see, Mars has a lot of good qualities. It's a planet of sports, of the muscles of our body. In fact, the heart is a muscle. Mars has a lot to do with willpower. It has a lot to do with your drive. It has a lot to do with sexuality and passions and desires and being a leader, because Mars rules Aries, and it also traditionally rules Scorpio. But because Mars has traditionally been considered the god of war, after that new moon happened, in Aquarius on February 17, then what happened was, just before they launched this whole thing on February 28th, on Saturday, America and Russia. Oh my God, America.
Gosh, was that a Freudian slip there?
That's a Freudian slip. Well, maybe Russia was in there too, with Vladimir, like, talking to Benjamin and
Probably.
Donald Trump, saying, "Go for it, guys." Like, I want to win my war over here, and I've been waiting for 4 years. As Donald Trump always says, hey, that would have never happened if I was president. Didn't have, that happened during the Biden administration, and he is right. Well, at any rate,
they're really good at pointing fingers at the other person, aren't they?
This is the whole key of surviving, is pointing fingers. You know what I mean? There are plenty of people who can be like, he did that. We didn't do it. That wasn't under our administration. So, don't blame us. You know what I mean? So that is the way a lot of people get. Anyway, so literally the day before all this firepower coming from Israel and the United States, Mars made a square to the outer planet Uranus, which is a planet of revolution. Uranus was discovered 1781, right when the American Revolution was found. This planet was found in England, 1781 in March. In fact, the anniversary of that happens on March 13th, which is going to be Friday the 13th, the second Friday the 13th of this year. We had February 13th. We're going to have March 13th and November 13th. And just so people know, the way you get a Friday the 13th, and the only way it can happen in our calendar thing, is if the month begins on a Sunday. Any month that begins on a Sunday will have a Friday the 13th. And there are some years where there's no month that begins on a Sunday, so we don't have a Friday the 13th. This year we have 3, and we're about to have the second one. And all those superstitions with the number 13. Go ahead.
Okay, I find that fascinating. So we have 3 Friday the 13th.
Right.
We have a full lunar eclipse, 3/3/2026 at 3:33 a.m.
Right.
And this year I have been seeing 33 like it's nobody's business. That's the number that my mind is picking up a lot. So there's a lot of 3s involved here. This is fascinating.
Okay. So let me give you an example in this chart. So if you research crusades, you go to Wikipedia, go wherever you want to go. And I did this a long time ago, so I spent a lot of time. And that's why I gave you this chart just before we started. And if people want to see it or whatever it is, they can go, and they're watching it now, or somebody sees this later. So on November 27 of 1095, at approximately early afternoon, in a town called Clermont, France, the Pope at that time had gotten everybody together because from our side, the infidels, these Muslim people, now remember 622 AD is the beginning of sort of the Muslim era, Muhammad, the whole thing of, this new religion. So we're talking about 400 plus years later. You see what I mean? This has to do with religious, in fact, the whole thing about Sunni and Shia, and I'm not an expert, but basically what I've read a long time ago was after the leader of, the Muslim world passed away, there was a son and there was a stepson, or there was a brother-in-law and a son. And that's where we get the division between the Sunni and the Shia. Who took over from Muhammad? That is basically why there are these two versions. And of course, if you go to places like Syria, it's just like with Protestantism. You'll have I don't know I don't want to say the wrong thing, but if there's probably different divisions of how Shia would be and different divisions how Sunni would be. They'd be subtle things. But again, you want to see what you just said correctly when you said, and all those Protestant divisions all have the truth. Well, if they all had the truth, you know what it would be? It would be the Lutheran Church. I mean, Martin Luther created, you just go back in history, these 95 things that he put on this cathedral in the town he was living in Germany, basically saying to the Pope, look, we want to study the Bible and do it ourselves. Do not tell us from Rome what we need to think. That was, what does it mean to be a Protestant? It was a protest. That's where the name comes from. And in England, with Henry VIII and so on, they created the Anglican Church. So that's why in England, like Scotland was Catholic. All the stuff you watch with Braveheart and these things, or what was going on, or Northern Ireland versus Ireland, the whole thing of Wales and, that is a whole world of all of this fighting of Protestantism and Catholicism and history and the King James Version. They have their whole thing, right? And if you go back, I mean, you may not know all of this like I did, but these killings that took place, the fact that Ireland and the fact that Northern Ireland is not in flames is amazing. Because when I was growing up and when I was in my 20s and 30s, there were killings all the time. You know what I mean? Murders of people in London because the Irish, the Northern Irish. So what you'd have is that Ireland became free as a country, but Northern Ireland, which is in the northern part of Ireland, is part of Great Britain. You see, and that's still the case. And Scotland has never become free. You know what I mean? So there's all
darn
that stuff.
Brits, man.
What's that?
I said those darn Brits. They're conquering.
And look, they were and it's not insignificant. If the Spanish Armada in the 1500s this is a whole other thing about Catholic from Spain. They were all on their way to England, which at that point was Queen Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Henry VIII. And the Anglican Church had just started. So basically, England was Protestant, for the most part. And Spain, with the Armadas coming, they're all Catholic. And they had already created the Inquisition earlier in the 13 and 1400s, like 100 plus years of, burning people at the stake and doing whatever they were doing. You know what I mean? Which is also how we got Friday the 13th. As you probably have had people, the Knights Templar, the guy who was in charge, was burned at the stake October 13th of whatever it was by the King of France.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
To this day, Freemasons that build a lot of buildings are built by Freemasons, and they're masonry, obviously, but the 13th floor is very difficult to find in a skyscraper still.
Look, I grew up in New York City. Okay. I mean, New York City. And anytime you went into a building, talk about what Donald Trump was building in Queens, or, his father in Queens and he in New York. I don't know at that point was you would never see in the elevator the number 13. It would be 12, 14. You see what I mean? Now, here's the funny thing. The number 14th would have been actually the 13th floor. It was a number. You see, I mean, you can't not have a floor. The only way you could do that would be if there was a space. Right. Okay, we're building you want to not have a 13th floor in your building? We have the perfect thing. We got 12 floors, space, and then we just start with number 14, and we go as high as we want. Now, I'm just joking around, but the point is you can't eliminate a 13th floor. You can only maneuver it to make it seem like it. I mean, Can you imagine that we have all these buildings in different cities, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, whatever it is, where you go in an elevator, an older building, and you don't see a number 13 because of that superstition that goes back to the Knights Templar in France and this guy being burned at the stake. And these were the people who supposedly had the Holy Grail, and they were the first merchants. They were basically, they're the first bank in the world. Their leader, I mean, the King of France said, look, I don't like what's going on here. They captured the guy, they tortured him, and they burned him at the stake. That date is a fact. You know what I mean?
And isn't 13 also associated with the divine feminine?
Well, yeah, see, there's 13 moon, like each of us have 13 lunar returns. The old astrology, you see, we didn't, this is so much for one session, but from the time of Julius Caesar, who died in 44 BC, et tu, Brute, and so on, they had reformed the calendar from before that. So we had what was called the Julian calendar. The reason we have the month of July is because Julius Caesar had been emperor, and they instituted a calendar like in 50 BC or whatever it is, shortly before he was murdered. Okay, so from BC to the 1500s, we had the Julian calendar, and then we found out that we were missing like a day or something. So what happened was then under Pope Gregory the whatever, all these people, these pretty bright people, got together in the 1500s, and this took several hundred years, and they said, so this is a fact, when George Washington was born, and we supposedly celebrate that on February 22nd, 1732, guess what? He wasn't born on February 22nd. He was born on February 11th, because America was still using the Julian calendar. You see, we hadn't gone over to the Gregorian calendar. Now, eventually in his life, then it was like we switched over. You see what I mean? So if you looked at his gravestone or something, it should have said February 11th, 1732. Which was the actual day in the Julian calendar Washington was born. But then America converted to this other calendar. So a lot of countries didn't do it because they thought it was almost like a devil thing. You know what I mean? Countries lost like 10 or 11 days. So that when different countries did this thing, you had to make believe. It would be like, okay, let's say it's my birthday, like I said, March 10th. If this was 1732, right? And it would be like, okay, then I was born March 10, 1732, and then the Gregorian calendar comes in, and then suddenly I wasn't born March 10th, I was actually born March 21st, because that would have been the date in the Gregorian calendar. And a lot of countries this is witchcraft, you know what I mean? But they didn't understand science, that we were trying to say, look, we've been losing like a quarter of a day, you see what I mean? The year had been like 364. And if you take the number 13, this is related to the moon has about a 28-day cycle, but it's actually 27 and a third days. But let's just round it off to 28. You multiply by 28 by 13, you get 364. So the old year wasn't 365 and a quarter. It was approximated. They didn't know. You see what I mean? We know now. It's so exact. GPL, all the science, you know what I mean? Astronomy, astrology, all these charts. Like this chart for the first crusade is amazing because it was November 27, 1095. If my math is correct, that's 931 years ago. And I can go in my computer, which has all of this stuff, and find the exact sun, moon, rising, planets. This is when the Pope in this conference in Clermont, France, gathered together all these leaders because Islamic rebels had taken over or were taking over Jerusalem. And so this was a call for Christians from France and Germany and from all over Europe to come and, become this crusade to take back the Holy Land or to take back Jerusalem. In Kingdom of God by with Ridley Scott, that movie, I don't know if you know it, with Orlando Bloom and Ava Green. It was a big thing back in the 90s. It's a great movie, Kingdom of God. They focus on one of the crusades and the fighting between the Christian crusaders and the Muslims who eventually took over that. So there were about 7 crusades over several hundred years, you know what I mean, that were called crusades. It wasn't one. But this was the first one. So this is the very beginning. Now we talk about the number 3 in this chart. The planet Uranus, it's hard to see, is at 21 of Aries, which is the rising sign of this chart is Pisces. The sun is overhead in Sagittarius, the circle with the point. If you look at what's called the 11th house in the upper left, you'll see the symbol of Jupiter. It looks like a crescent with a cross. That's at 21 of Capricorn. Uranus is at 21 of Aries in house number 2 in a fire sign. And Mars, the planet of war, is at 21 of Leo in house number 6 on the right. That is creating what we call a Pythagorean triangle. Okay, it is a 3, 4, 5 triangle. It is said that the Great Pyramid, okay, with all of its magical measurements, that Pythagoras, when was the school of numerology, the music of the spheres, like in 500 BC in a place called Crotona, Italy, and people all over the globe, or whoever could find out, went there. It was almost like a Zen monastery kind of place, and people learned about numbers. 3, what is the meaning of 3? What is the meaning of 1? All these primary numbers, all this kind of magic. And that was an actual school of Pythagorean, knowledge and wisdom at a place in southern Italy. And out of that, there's in astrology, this is a very unusual thing. When President Kennedy died that day, when the when the patriots dressed up, Native Americans, and they threw the tea into Boston Harbor that day, and when the Third Reich of Germany began in, what's the date there? January 30th of 1933. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and then eventually took over Germany. But before he did take over, there was that group of people there had been 2 other beginnings of Germany, a First Reich and a Second Reich in history. So this was this new formation in Germany, and there's a date for that. What I'm saying is a chart with a 3, 4, 5 triangle means that planets are 90 degrees apart, which we call a square. Then there's a trine, which is favorable, 120 degrees. And then there's this other one called an oblique, 150 degree aspect. It's a very rare thing. And this is an exact 3, 4, 5, 90 degrees, 120, 150. And I hadn't looked at this for many years until this morning and when I sent it to you. So when you think of 333, when you think of 3-3, right? Embedded in the first crusade is another one of these triangles. You see, that's very exact. And while it isn't just, like an equilateral triangle, okay, there actually is, if you take Mercury in this chart, which is at 22 of Sagittarius, there is both a equilateral triangle, like 3-3-3, and there's this other one of 3-4-5. So the first crusade begins with an extraordinary, what we call a pattern, you know what I mean, of triangles. So what you just said, one of the things that people don't realize, think, oh, that's just silly. What's the big deal about 3-3 or 333? And there's so much online about like 1-1-1-1. You look at the clock and it's 2-2-2. This happens to me all the time, by the way. I think what is true about all this is as you get into all the stuff that you are presenting to the public, and so on, what's happening is when you get closer to the power, whether it's UFOs, flying saucers, different alien things, secrets being revealed, and what you're presenting is an enormous amount of empowerment, because the people come on just like myself and where you are, we're all passionate. That's a Mars quality, I've been in touch with Richard Hoagland, The Face on Mars. One of the magazines you'll see there was many decades ago.
Richard.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, we still don't know. I mean, there's all this stuff. We don't want to go into who's blocking it, but like I did a whole magazine about when the Mars Observer mission, this was one of my most frustrating things. A mission called the Mars Observer that we launched, okay, it was going to go over these areas to see what was happening with the face on Mars. And as it got closer, and I did a whole cover story, NASA said, we've lost control of it. We don't know what happened. And they still have never reported what happened to the Mars observer. And I was so angry
Turkey.
because it was my cover story,
Yeah.
and I felt as if like, it's like, I have to be more I mean, how careful can you be? They gave the dates, the times it was going to arrive. I did a whole cover story, and then it's like, oh, sorry, it never got there. We don't know what happened.
Oops.
Oops. We sent it to Venus. We thought we were sending it to Mars. Goof.
We miscalculated that a little bit.
And look, Richard Hoagland created a whole book about like this stuff. You know what I mean? Because he was pissed off. And then a lot of the problems was he was then being questioned. There was also what's his name? Tom Van Flanderen, the exploding planet hypothesis. See, I was in touch with him. He was on many different places because that fits into Star Wars and George Lucas and the movie of Alderaan in the first movie being exploded by the Death Star. Because the problem we have, and this is a whole other subject. I think I brought it up before, and I did part of my podcast is about the secret of Star Wars and George Lucas. But the largest asteroid is what we call Ceres. That's the Roman name, and the Greek name is Demeter. And that asteroid was discovered on New Year's Day, 1801, in Sicily. And when these asteroids like Pallas Athena and Juno and Vesta and Ceres were discovered in the early 1800s, these are little planets between Mars and Jupiter. But now we know there are thousands. The point is, this is a fact, everybody. There's what's called Bode's Law. And under Bode's Law, it actually has a slightly different name. Mercury is where Mercury, a planet should be in the orbit of Mercury. That's where Mercury is. Venus is in the spot where Venus should be. The Earth is in the spot where the Earth should be, according to scientific dynamic laws of the solar system. Okay. And then Mars is where it should be. The problem is where the asteroids are, and there are thousands of them. Ceres, the largest asteroid, is exactly, and it's the largest one, exactly there should be one planet. But instead, we have a large asteroid, which was named by the Astronomy Union in 2006. They finally said, okay, we're going to say that Ceres is a dwarf planet.
Right.
Instead of using that term, and they demoted Pluto, which got everybody upset. Now, astrologers never gave up. Yeah.
Was that around 2000?
It was 2005 or 6. And here's another fact. When that Astronomy Union came out with that, 5-6 of the astronomers had actually gone home. The remaining astrologers, this is in the Czech Republic, we're gonna demote Pluto, and let's raise up Ceres, and it all had to do with orbital dynamics. Like
Let me
Pluto
jump in on that.
Huh?
Let me jump in on that. I think this is important because a lot of people, including myself, when they did that shortly after they discovered we've got Sedna, we've got Ceres, these new planets, but then they demote Pluto, and then and we're talking about Badagen and Brown here, the two main culprits of this. Then they come out and say, "Oh, well, we think we found Planet 9."
Exactly.
Planet 9. And so some people wonder, this is where the conspiracy comes in. And I'm not convinced of this, but I think it's interesting. Like a lot of people believe in Planet X, the Nemesis. Nibiru is one name for it, which means the crossing.
Years.
But so some people have questioned because they demoted Pluto and then they say they found Planet 9, they didn't have to call it Planet X.
Yeah. This is what I won't go.
It's a fun one, though.
This is gobbledygook. This was a word. You've heard it.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to spell. But, in Hebrew, there's another one I start using. By the way, I do have, folks, for 44 and a half years, I've created a daily guide. It's called the Cosmic Calendar. Let's see. This is going to look backwards. Okay. Can you see this, folks? This is an example of what has been in Welcome to Planet Earth, those magazines in the center. Starting in 1981, it's called the Cosmic Calendar. So I can't make it look regular because it's backwards. But be like Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, you see what I'm saying? Go this way. Mirror writing. You see, astrology.
It's coming out right on our side.
Huh?
It's coming out right on our side. Yeah.
Oh, okay. March 1 to 31. Now I just finished this the whole month. So look, every day, and if you go to Iconic Astrology, I did 5 calendars with a company called Amber Lotus. I am not saying this from an ego standpoint. I'm a you know, I'm a little different as an astrologer. I have two hats, just as astrologer: world astrology, earth astrology, the oath of office of a president, somebody passing away, the start of a war. Now, like in this case, you see, now literally there's been so much. There is a moment of time. Okay, after, like when we say March 3rd, the blood moon, and I do want to say something about the president's chart. So the build up to this latest thing between, you know, regardless of what you hear every day, like right now, Marco Rubio is saying it was Iran's fault. You know what I mean? They were going to do this thing. So we came in and we did it. You know, this is like the blame game, the finger pointing, like, what did we do? Why did we do it? There's no doubt. Look, this is a country, like, first of all, I think I'm okay to say this. I mean, Israel has nuclear weapons. Have they ever been in it? No. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. You know, it's a source of pride because they and India are always fighting. By the way, in the last week, guess who's fighting? I mean, angry with each other. Pakistan and Afghanistan.
That's right.
They're in another thing, and you know, it gets no press. Syria, there's all this stuff happening again, and I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not predicting this, folks. Bashar al-Assad is not dead, the previous ruler. And the guy who's in charge of Syria went to visit the president, our president, in the White House, got his like thumbs up because he was a radical that we were against. But now he's basically put on a suit and tie. You know what I mean? Like when in Egypt, you know, there was a leader not so long ago who was elected who also was taken out, and the United States put in Sisi, is I think his name, or Sisi, Sissi, who I think is still in power. He was a general, and we made him take off his general uniform to become president of Egypt. He's still that. We have have you heard anything about Egypt in the last couple of weeks? Nothing. Even with Gaza and the whole thing, you don't hear almost anything about Egypt, and we have a whole alliance with them. You know, you hear a lot about Saudi Arabia, and they're fighting in Yemen against these different people and Hamas and Hezbollah and so on. The problem, what's happening now, and it is a wider war, you know what I mean? People want to fly and go on vacation, you know what I mean? People are worried because, again, what this opens the door to, and I mean, look, the audience to be the judge, regardless of your political beliefs, we have no idea, like there's nothing, this is not like George Bush #1. We're going to free Kuwait. We're going to take out all these things. We're not going to take Saddam Hussein because there's a mission and we have a goal. You know what I mean? That was the clearest of these wars. Then the second one was weird with George Bush Jr. because we were fighting Saddam Hussein when we should have been dealing with Saudi Arabians and Osama bin Laden, who had escaped. You know, remember George Bush saying, "Wanted, dead or alive, you know, we're going to smoke them out of their caves." You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
But who got him? Obama, you know, of all things. It's under Obama after 10 or 11 years. And that was right after that correspondence dinner when he made fun of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump sat there and took it and, you know, laughed a little bit, smirked a little bit. And then it was like 2 days later. We didn't know it. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Biden said, don't do it. And Obama did it. And then they got Osama bin Laden, and that was the end of Osama bin Laden. But that's just one person. This is what it is. It's like you get rid of one person, right? So if you watch the news, everybody, and it's hard for me to watch news, but it comes on one of my apps, like on my phone. So we eliminated the current Ayatollah, who had been in power for 37 years since he took over from the previous one. And the thing is, do you remember when President Trump said a few days ago or whatever it is, he was on national TV, and he sort of asked the Iranian people to revolt, you know, so to speak, you know, take back your country.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, look, a very pure, innocent thing, for, you know, open thing. And Netanyahu made the same speech because the point is that on the larger scheme of things, what do we want in the world, right? Politics, religion, Christianity versus Islam, you know, right wing versus left wing, you know, what is true, what isn't true, you know what I mean? All of these different things. The bottom line, and this is what did I even bring up the First Crusade? Here's the problem. These three Persian Gulf Wars, or these three wars in the Middle East, we're still fighting the Crusades, everybody, because in our own country, right, the issue of who is an American, this is, in fact, the Supreme Court is about to come make a decision about the birthright kind of thing. You know what I mean? Historically, like like the part of their view, or from, what is it, the 14th Amendment? Sorry if I don't remember all my amendments. I think it was the 14th, whatever. Back in the 1800s, after the Civil War, one of the amendments was passed, which said, even if you're not an American citizen, right? This is what they're debating, and the president and his group want to eliminate what's called birthright, that like a child of somebody who is not an actual citizen, but if they have a baby in the United States, that baby, because it's born in America, is an American citizen. See, that's what they want to overturn. You know what I mean? To say, and that was the problem is, it's just like, if you don't study, like for instance, in 1919, we banned alcohol. I mean, alcohol, it wasn't all banned, but this is what led to bootlegging in the 20s, all these movies,
And the rise of the Italian mobsters.
Well, and then we reversed it. It's the only time then in 1933, after 14 years of saying, we're banning alcohol, we realized it wasn't working. We were creating exactly what you're saying. When you look at the Roaring Twenties and you see all these movies, Edward G. Robinson, Humphrey Bogart, all these people. I mean, they weren't even then, because that was the silent era. Al Jolson, all these other things. But what then happened in the 1930s? Like the heyday of these film noirs, 1940s, Alfred Hitchcock, Casablanca, and all these other movies, and Edward G. Robinson, and You Dirty Rat, like with James Cagney and all these gunslingers, was sort of like because of all that stuff with the mafias and criminals, Dillinger, all these people. It goes back to like Jesse James in the 1800s. You know what I mean? Robbing banks because of the railroads and throwing people off their land. It's a very interesting part of American history. You know what I mean? Very fascinating. The building of the railroads, and going to people who work their farms and just say, we're giving you nothing, but you have to move because of the transatlantic railroad. You know what I mean? And we see this in all these movies. And it's a fascinating history, regardless of how we view it politically and so on. It's part of what made America. And all these different, nationalities coming through Ellis Island, and also from the West Coast with the gold rush. You know what I mean? It's just amazing of like what we're dealing with now and what the world is dealing with now. I come from a perspective, I just want people to understand, from a spiritual angle, I do not agree that it was a good idea. This is just personally for me, and I am born Jewish, but I'm not a very religious person that way. That the intrusion of creating Israel, you see, as a state, from the studies I've done, was a mistake. Okay. So that's just my personal opinion from looking at it spiritually, because by going back 2,000 years to create a homeland, and there was a reason for that because of World War II and what happened to Jewish people. So this would already been in the works for decades. And then you can watch movies like Paul Newman was in one of them. There's just so many different things about the building of the state of Israel. And astrologically, Israel began May 14th of 1948, and the planet Uranus had come back from when it was discovered in 1781 during the American Revolution, which led to America being free from England. And Uranus has an 84-year cycle. So if you add 2 of those 84-year cycles, you get like 168 years. You add that to 1781, and approximately, and then you get the creation of the state of Israel began when Uranus returned to its own position, a planet of revolution. So when Israel became a country, immediately they were fighting a war. There's been like 5 or 6 wars in the Middle East, all because they took this area of land, you see what I mean, and they took it away from Palestinians. Okay. Palestine basically was mostly Jordan, and this Gaza area and so on, but they carved out this place called Israel. And so many of Jewish people from all over Europe and the United States went over there to live, to become Israelis fundamentally. I've been there. And by the way, a quarter of the population of Israel is not Jewish. Okay. There are many actually, which is interesting. So 75% of the country is Jewish, but 25% of Israel, it's not all Jewish, folks. It's it's of different nationalities, you know, Arab and so on, um, Sunni, Shia. You see what I'm saying? It's different nationalities. All some of people were there already, and their families stayed there when Israel became a state. And it's not as if all of them were attacked by, you know, Jewish people in the establishment of the country. But the problem was that Harry Truman, as president, was the first president. And when Israel came into being, February 14th of 48, he said, okay, America recognizes Israel. And that started all these different rulers to say, yeah, we did also. But they were fighting against these other countries in the Middle East. And it's been turmoil since that time. My point in all this is the Israeli chart, which we know very well, is going to have Uranus come back to its own position over the next several years. It's not yet, but it's going to be, you know, in the next several years. They will have that happening. And sooner than that, we're having in our country a Uranus return in like 2 or 3 years. Sort of when this current Trump administration would be ending, if he stays healthy or whatever, as he leaves office, if he does leave office, we'll have a Uranus return. And when our Civil War happened, Uranus came back. And when we fought in World War II, Uranus came back. It's every 84 years. And now we're going to have it again. And that's why there's, you know, there have been movies and all this stuff about a new civil war in our country. You know, we see it politically, but it's not necessarily like, you know, what it was. But for World War II, when Uranus came back, that's when we joined France and the Allies because we were invaded by, I mean, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And, you know, actually, you know, when you look back on it, a day later, Germany declared war on the United States. And had Germany not declared war on the United States, we might not have declared war on Germany. See, we declared war on Japan. And because Japan and Germany and Italy were all allied, Hitler and Germany decided, okay, we're going to declare war on America, because at that point in 1941 was during the Battle of Britain, and the Germans were winning in Europe. You see what I mean? He had no reason not to, like, okay, now we'll take down America because our ally Japan just bombed Pearl Harbor. You know what I mean? They killed 3,000 people. The odds of America coming back are remote. And it was the exact opposite. In the war in the Pacific, America triumphed over Japan. All the battles in Europe started moving in the favor of the Allies. And so it's just really interesting about who does what and who's committed to doing what. And by the way, the last time we ever, you know, Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress and said, I asked Congress for a declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. And had the Congress not voted, we wouldn't have gone to war against Japan. Now we don't do that, right? Bush too didn't, you know, I mean, he did get the Senate to agree. You see what I mean? But, you know, the thing was, you know, he got an agreement. It wasn't exactly, I guess maybe it was sort of, but it wasn't exactly the same thing that Franklin Roosevelt did by getting the entire Congress. What Bush did was getting the Senate to sort of say, okay, do what you want to do. You know what I mean? It's okay. You know what I mean? Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. Go after him. But that was more like a personal thing. And Iraq had not bombed us. You see what I mean? Japan had bombed us, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Saddam Hussein was actually our ally. This is what is weird. We went to war against Saddam Hussein because George Bush said, the guy tried to kill my dad. I'm very angry about that. I don't want my dad to be killed. You know what I mean? He looked at his father as a, you know, but the point is that this is what was being said. But because Saddam Hussein supposedly had weapons, it's the same thing that's happening now. What did Bush do? What did Trump do last year? We obliterated their capacity for nuclear weapons. That was June of last year. Now we're saying, wait, they could still actually attack us. I thought we actually had to remember the obliteration of the bombing. And
Man,
well, the point is that he came to power saying, look, we're not going to do regime change. I'm going to be president of peace. And look, things change. he's a transactional person. Did anyone think, every tariff like that we were going to try and get Greenland? And we find out that Truman tried to get Greenland. Every time it's like, the thing about Donald Trump, his chart is so unusual, is almost every single thing that he ever sort of declares, there's an element of truth in there somewhere. So like somebody saying, it's outrageous about Greenland, you're out of your mind. Then it's like, Truman wanted Greenland. Under FDR, it's a big continent. We can't have German submarines hanging around there. But we actually do have an agreement with Denmark about the use of these bases. The thing is that we have a president who is a builder. You see, he wants to own things. You see what I mean? We want to own Greenland. We want that power. We don't want to necessarily have Denmark telling us anything. Who is Denmark? They're over there.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Man, you make it tough to jump. You get going. It's like, Mark, stop. I have a question. You're doing good, man. You're doing good. Gosh, I almost lost train of thought on this.
Greenland.
Where the heck was I going? No. Okay, please continue. And then when I remember it again, I'll raise my hand.
Okay, let me see if I can get you back to where we're at. All of these astrology charts, the thing that people need to know is the problem in the public eye and online is, oh my God, there's a blood moon. Wow, a blood moon, and we're fighting in a war, and why would they call it a blood moon, and 333 and these numbers? So let me say something that's really crucial. If I don't know who's advising Trump with astrology, but we know that Nancy Reagan advised Ronald Reagan as governor, and for 7 years we never found out. This is true, folks, because you can go back to an article, Astrology in the White House, Time magazine, in 1987, when Don Regan, who was the chief of staff to President Reagan, said, I quit because I can't tell Ronald Reagan anything because his wife has an astrologer who's setting up all the meetings with Gorbachev. And that's true. That woman, in fact, I gave a talk about my book, Mysteries of Venus, at a conference, and I always forget her last name. But she wrote a biography. What did Joan say? Okay, so she had written that biography, and in 1989, I gave a talk. My book, wrote a book, Mysteries of Venus, in '86. So, in an astrology conference, I was given an opportunity to stand before everybody and talk about Mysteries of Venus, what I learned about the planet Venus. Like Velikovsky, Worlds in Collision, was 1950. Venus and Mars supposedly had changed their orbits. That created a problem with Velikovsky, with Carl Sagan. And Einstein sided with Velikovsky and said, look, planets might move. You have talked about this, I'm sure, with the whole thing, with Nibiru and all of these different places. The world was very different in 3000 BC with UFOs. And that's another thing I have to talk about soon. Steven Spielberg's book, movie Disclosure Day, it comes out June 12th. I've already looked at the astrology, 2 days before Trump's birthday, a month before the 250th anniversary of our country. Disclosure Day, Spielberg has his son conjunct our galactic center, the center of the Milky Way galaxy, which is this whole, we know it's a black hole, but it's like, that's part of our galaxy. And he and Arthur C. Clarke, A Space Odyssey, Childhood's End, Arthur C. Clarke, who lived in Ceylon and so on, his brilliant energy, also his birthday. These are Sagittarian people. Steven Spielberg is December 18 of 1946. And Arthur C. Clarke was born a generation before, but he's also like December 17th. The day that the Wright brothers did their powered air flight that started the whole air flight, world, was December 17 of 1903, and the sun was at the galactic center, and there was a new moon conjunct Uranus, headlines the day after the Wright brothers. That is also Sagittarius, which is conjunct the galactic center. By the way, Vladimir Putin's Mars is at that same spot. So there are these places, folks, that are astronomical as well as astronomical. And that's one of the most important things that I have studied. I love astronomy, you see what I mean? And astronomy and astrology used to be one. Back thousands of years ago in the Bible, you'll read and it will say things like the Magi, like with Jesus in the New Testament. We saw his star appear, you see what I mean? So these three magi are going to give, gold and frankincense and myrrh and so on to the newborn king, right? Now, there's all the questions of what was that star? What was the star of Bethlehem? And there's a lot of interesting astronomy. What it basically was that Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, this is an astronomy fact, several years before the 0 point, like in what we call 6-7 BC, there was a triple conjunction that astronomers saw this bright, what looked like a star, because three planets were in the same spot, like in a little triangle. This is a fact. I have a book called The Star of Bethlehem by an astronomer, and they go back scientifically to several years before the 0 point. And if Jesus was born, as we think, around 6 BC, okay, there's a whole bunch of things like about that particular energy that was predicted in the Old Testament, that a Messiah would show up for the Jewish people when Jupiter and Saturn would form a conjunction in the constellation of Pisces. Because in those days, we're dealing with constellations rather than signs. Anyway, maybe I've gotten us worse off than we were. But the point is that the thing is that the whole thing about the holy city, like it's only under Trump. You see, what was the capital of Israel? I mean, where was our U.S. embassy? It was in Tel Aviv, which is the governmental center. And under the Abraham Accords and under Trump with Netanyahu, we moved our embassy to Jerusalem, which is the holy city. So all of this stuff, supposedly America is this Judeo-Christian because of Old Testament and New Testament. And that's what's being played out, and why we have all these issues about who is an American. Maybe it goes back to the birthright thing. Maybe that's where we're going, because the Supreme Court is going to try and figure out.
It was actually no, I remember now. Thank you. It was there's another bill that's being presented to allow for a third term, and the way that to basically potentially keep Trump in, because I think you were talking about that for a little bit. That will be interesting to see where that goes. I see a lot of division now, especially with President Trump authorizing this war. Basically,
it's not impossible. I brought up the alcohol thing about drinking. That was rescinded. So you came in. I mean, it's the only time we have whatever the amendment was that said you can't drink alcohol. Then 14 years later, through the now here's the thing: is that what would probably need to happen, and it could happen, what would be most likely is the Supreme Court said, this is what you should do. The amendment that forbids anyone from a third or fourth term came out of the fact that Franklin Roosevelt had 4 terms. Okay, that's why it was. In his 4th term, he died 3 months later. So because he was president for so long, there was nothing in the Constitution, an amendment was passed, okay? And how do you get an amendment to pass? There's like 2 ways to do it. One is you get 3/4 of the states, whatever 3/4 is of 50, it's like an odd number. And you have to basically get everybody to vote, you see, in a particular vote, I guess.
Is
like
this the constitutional referendum you're speaking of?
Yeah. What I'm saying is, look, the Supreme Court, I think what they will do, if that comes in there, they will say, look, if for President Trump to run again, you see, which would not be for 2 years, if the Republicans were to stay in power, you see what I mean, in the House, then what you do is you go and initiate a thing to say, okay, we're going to rescind the thing so that a person can go for a 3rd term, let's just say, or it's open-ended. The days of Franklin Roosevelt long gone. We've had 1-term president, we had 2-term presidents, and it doesn't mean somebody's going to be a king, but if the people want somebody to be there for more than 2 terms, my sense is the Supreme Court will vote for something like that because it is conservative. And what they would be saying, it's not so much conservative. They say, look, the country should be free. We declared that you shouldn't have 4 terms because we were worried because there wasn't a law about it. And we don't want that to happen again, and whether left or right. So they declared that thing. But now, part of it is that President Trump and his group feel like, he wants to be able to run. Now, the problem is that he's 82. He'd be 80, like 2 years old. You see what I mean? That would mean that he'd be 86. Right. We know that Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan was the oldest president. He was 69. And we do know in retrospect, even though Nancy Reagan was doing all that astrology stuff, in looking back, this is the other thing. Do we trust Donald Trump's doctors? Do we trust Joe Biden's doctors? Or do we trust any of these presidents? Look, John F. Kennedy had all these things, Addison's disease. They lied there because they didn't want people to know he had a bad back and he was sick and was taking pills. People didn't know that Franklin Roosevelt had polio. You know what I mean? He was leaning on his son. He, moved around. We didn't have television. Do you see what I mean? We had radio. People weren't looking and saying, hey, he can't walk by himself. You see what I mean? So
let me jump in on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, because right now, what we do have is so much information, which somebody just brought up in the comment section, at our fingertips. It's almost like too much information at times because there's so much disinformation. And I think that's why a lot of people see the end of the world now more than they did 40, 50 years ago, because you've got, like you brought up earlier, breaking news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's the end of the world, always tomorrow, folks. You've always got, they always want you on the edge. You're going to be sitting there watching that show. And they're like, okay, I gotta vote. I got to go buy this. I got to prepare for the end of the world. And I got to bring in my tomato plants.
Hey, listen, I've got to do one little thing here. And I know, we're the funny thing is using a computer, as you were just talking there, and we talked about the little background behind you, and I won't say anything about it. My battery on my computer is saying energy saver on. And, like if I were like superstitious, it's like, wait a minute, Wi-Fi. Why is my why at this moment of time when we're about to come to the climax of our discussion here and come up with like the final words, is like, we've lost Mark. So I'm plugging in, folks. I've saved my computer. We're going to keep going on for a couple minutes to get this thing. But listen, I know we're
in bonus time now, folks.
We're in bonus time. This, what this is like? All those shows where you can now go on, it'll say, well, if you like this thing, you know what I mean, go online to see this other part of this interview. You know what I mean? One of the things I find fascinating is this computer. My daughter, I have two daughters. I love both of them. They're both amazing. They have different skill sets. And the thing is, I wasn't feeling well 2+ years ago, going through stuff. You know what I mean? I was tired. I couldn't sleep very well. And she got me this computer which is a Windows 11. I've had to use Windows. She uses Macs, and I have to use Windows because all the main astrology programs for decades, not all of them, there are not a lot of them now on Mac, but the ones that I needed to use were on Windows. So every version, 0.2, 0.5 of these new programs. So she was able to program this computer, which is on Windows, and put in all these astrology programs when I wasn't feeling well. And it was like, oh my God, like, you're a Mac person. How were you able to do this? And I'm still kind of shocked that she was able to do it. But it's sort of what I was saying to you before about this overwhelming kind of thing of what we're having to deal with information. My worry, like with AI coming about, look, in our lifetime, and you're a lot younger than I am, it's almost unimaginable to me that the most extreme thing has always been nuclear weapons. You know what I mean? Like, since I've been, like from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, August of, this is the way World War II ended, and the decision by Truman, one way or another, and of course people like blame him. How dare you do this to Hiroshima and Nagasaki? They were basically, they weren't, it's not like, it's not like Berlin, where Hitler is, or, London where Churchill is. I mean, whatever. Look, London was bombed, the Battle of Britain, all over, we bombed plenty of places, the Allies. I don't know if you know who Kurt Vonnegut was, but he was a great writer, comic writer. And he wrote a book called Slaughterhouse-Five, of the firebombing of Dresden, Germany, by the Allies. This whole thing that killed 100,000 Germans. After the war had changed, you see, this was the thing. This is exactly where we're at now. Exactly what the Secretary of War, they haven't officially renamed it, but they're saying it, where he has said over the last, this is what I find dangerous just going back historically, because the Luftwaffe, the only way that England survived, was that the Royal Air Force, you see, was fairly good, and they had discovered radar. You see what I mean? They were ahead of the Germans. The Germans had rearmed. So you had Hermann Goring, you know, and then wave after wave of these planes were going over London and so on. And the people were going into the subways. You can, there's, you know, Darkest Hour, you know, people should watch that on Netflix. It's a fantastic movie. The guy, I always forget his name. At any rate, he won the Academy Award. The movie didn't, but he won Academy Award Best Actor for playing Winston Churchill. He spent 4 hours a day becoming Winston Churchill. And while they, you know, the fundamental story, it's a wonderful movie, you know what I mean, about Winston Churchill defying, you know, the leaders of Germany, and only he understood. After a lot of losses in World War I and so on, you get this person who's 60 plus years old, you know what I mean, Winston Churchill becoming basically the savior of England. And if the Nazis had actually won that, you know, then there's all this. There's a show called The Man in the High Castle. There's all these stories that have been written if America, you know, sort of had lost the war, you know, and I saw that just came on to Netflix. It's based on a lot of novels, and things could have easily turned, you know, in a way. But right now, one of the things that America's articulating, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right, the thing is, look, we don't want countries to develop nuclear weapons. Like, we didn't want North Korea to do it, but they did it anyway. You know what I mean? We couldn't stop them. I mean, they still, you know, they're allied with Russia more than China, but they're particularly allied with Russia. And what are we going to do about North Korea? You know what I mean? I mean, President Trump has had that, you know, like brother love with Kim Jong-un, you know, and he went over there, you know,
Oh
no other
yeah, I
president
remember
done
that.
that. Yeah, like, and Trump is a completely different person. He's doing everything completely different than anybody else. That's his thing. It's a transactional thing. The challenge of that is that, well, it's a very powerful tool to sit down and say, look, both Bushes didn't go over there. No president ever negotiated with the leaders of North Korea. So we've been in this stalemate. And to his credit, you know, Donald Trump said, I'll go over there. I'll talk to the guy. And, you know, and remember in the beginning was like, my button is bigger than your button. And then that became a bromance. He went over, okay, let's have a discussion. Now, they didn't really solve anything, but they did have a meeting. You know what I mean? Kim Jong-un is into basketball. He was in Switzerland. You know what I mean? This is part of the problem of politics. And the answer is sports. It's always been sports. The Olympics, we just had the Olympics. You see what I mean? They
Oh yeah.
restarted in 1896. The you know, the miracle on ice, which from 1980, now the American skaters just won double gold, which, you know, the men beat Canada. That hadn't happened since, you know, 1980, when we beat a professional team from the Russians, and our team were college kids. That was one of the greatest moments, because that happened right after the whole thing with the hostages. We're still in the embassy, our embassy. This was when Carter was president. He tried to get out the hostages. He failed. He said, I mean, that was actually a few months later, after we won against the Russians. And that was literally 66, let's see, it was 1980, okay, that happened. So 66 years ago, whatever it was, the American ice skaters just won for the first time from when that happened in 1980. Our team had never won again until this year. And then the women won, you know, as simultaneously. So they're in
They look
Italy.
great.
Well, and what is Italy? What is northern Italy? In Milan. You see, this is, you know, one of the ways in which World War II ended was if you go through all the battles, we came up from North Africa. There was Rommel and so on, you know, the Desert Fox, and America and England and the Allied forces came up through Sardinia, and, you know, that whole area of Sicily and Sardinia. And we went from the American army, and the Allies went up from the boot of Italy and went north, because we wanted to get Italy out of the war, because Mussolini, we wanted him out, and that would begin the process of D-Day and everything else. So all of this was orchestrated by Eisenhower and all the military leaders, and that was the great achievement, you know what I mean, of World War II, which created NATO and everything else. And now the world is like, okay, because this is an issue, NATO is actually an organization. And there's an agreement that if Putin or anybody were attacked, like France or Lithuania or now Finland, or whoever's in there, you know what I mean? The 31 countries, Ukraine isn't, and they want to be in, and Putin doesn't want them to be in. And Turkey is also in there, and they have questions about stuff. So NATO is really wobbly. And one other thing that's important in all of this is, guess what country right now is that Europe is leaning on to become their new America if Donald Trump sort of backs out and says, hey, you know, do your
Germany
thing.
or France?
They want Germany. France, because Germany has 90 million people, they have the most power and they have the most economic power. So this is the same country that basically orchestrated under the Kaiser World War I. Austria-Hungary and Germany, allied with, I think it was Turkey, whoever it was, they were the shadow side, shall we say, against England and France. And Italy in the First World War was on the side of Italy, England and France. It changed in World War II. So Italy was an ally in World War I. They weren't an ally, you know, with England and France in World War II. That's because Mussolini was in there. And Mussolini was older than Adolf Hitler. So Adolf Hitler admired what Mussolini had done. This is all world history. Mussolini had attacked Ethiopia. And there was also the Spanish Revolution going on in the 1930s, made famous by Hemingway, you know, and all these different books and so on, and stories about the Spanish Revolution, which was Francisco Franco. So we had all these dictators, you know what I mean, in Spain, and we had it, you know, with Stalin, and we had it with Mao. That was the 1930s when good old Pluto was discovered, you see, which is the planet of the underworld. And that's why Pluto eventually got knocked off by the astronomers, but the astrologers know that Pluto is a very powerful force, and it is a planet. You can't get rid of it.
Hello, that's what I'm talking about. Well, let me.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question before I forget too. And somebody brought this up in the comment section. President Trump, was he born during a blood moon eclipse?
Okay, I'm glad you brought that back to me. That's where I was going. This is the amazing thing. I was saying, if I were advising President Trump, and I do believe, just like with Reagan, New York City, which is his home ground, if we're talking about where's the financial astrology focus in the United States, business-wise, Lower Manhattan. You know what I mean? The stock market area. That is where I have colleagues and so on. This is the center of financial and business astrology. It would not be surprising to me. I have no proof of this whatsoever, but I know some people who were part of this thing over, you know, when I was in New York getting into this years ago, who would be advising the president of the United States. I doubt whether they'd be advising him. I think they're advising Donald and Eric Trump. Okay, that would be my guess. That's why Bitcoin and all that stuff changed, where Donald Trump said, that's weird. You know, the US dollar is everything. And then suddenly I said, Dad, okay, I'm speculating. This is a speculation. You know, Bitcoin and Ethereum and all this other stuff. Here's where, because remember how Donald Trump said recently, or like in the last year or two, oh, well, let's get the Federal Reserve. Now he's changing the person in charge, because in order to create a digital coin or dollar, which the Chinese want to do, and all this energy and so on, this is another whole field that we could talk about another time. And I did do a lot of research on Elon Musk and Tesla and Bitcoin and so on, because that is very much connected to Elon Musk and Tesla and certain things that he was trying to do with Tesla, about people being able to literally buy Teslas with Bitcoin. This was a particular thing that happened a number of years ago. And that was it's part of the whole hidden thing of the history of Bitcoin. And there is basically a chart for that, because Bitcoin, it has a mysterious beginning of a person who's supposedly Japanese that nobody knows from 2009. So we're now 17.
Now they think it's Epstein. I'm serious. Did you read that? Did you read some of those files that came out?
I would not be surprised. Or
I wouldn't either.
They have a name for this person, but they've never seen who it is. They say it's a Japanese person.
Right.
It could have been that guy and Epstein had look. Who has not been in contact with Epstein? Stephen Hawking supposedly was with him. Woody Allen. I mean, you know.
Well, Woody Allen doesn't surprise me, but
no, but I mean, you know, I'm just saying these odd figures. I mean, the guy from Harvard, you know what I mean, who had Larry Summers has resigned as president of Harvard, who used to be the Treasury Secretary, because these people are now in the list, and there's like all of these millions of people. Now, it is interesting because I know, let me put it this way. Am I right? Aren't there topics that basically you don't want to talk about and then I'm not allowed
Yes.
to?
We can,
Okay.
well, we can talk about them on Patreon or the website or Rumble,
Right.
but
But
yeah.
what I mean is, it is like, it would not surprise me that some of these, as more things get revealed about the Epstein thing or the possibility of Bitcoin and all this other stuff, like, okay, so one, I think I can say this if you don't mind. The whole thing with Nancy Guthrie, the mother of Savannah Guthrie, being taken, we don't know what's happening with her, right, for the last month. What we do know from the original thing was whoever it was wanted Bitcoin. This was not going to be small. This is not a movie of like in groups of 10s and 20s in a bag, that you're going to drop off. This
Right.
is Bitcoin. Why?
Right.
Because one of the things about Bitcoin, if you've covered any about it, in which I've studied, is it's because it's decentralized. The whole beautiful thing supposedly about Bitcoin is it's not the Federal Reserve. It's not, it's not, it's not these powers, these hidden powers, gold, silver, money, coinage. It's basically, the theory is like, it's people money. That's the whole
Yeah,
premise.
like you're the bank. If you hold
Right.
it, it's
Yeah,
your,
like, and
yeah.
we don't want all of these people from the IRS or anybody else with taxes impinging on what we have. Now,
Well,
this gets into,
that's over now because yeah, if
no,
you own cryptos, they're real, they definitely get their tax money
no, I know
nowadays. But
everything's
I know what
changed.
the original point of it. I know what you mean, but
Look,
yeah.
I had my best friend say, Mark, you have to get into this. And from the beginning, I thought it was weird. But that's when, literally in the beginning, he was saying there's this thing called Bitcoin. It's only $50, $100. And he said, here's the beautiful thing. Create a wallet. This is what you do. You have a key, but don't do anything with it, because if you, this is like 17 years ago, just
Yeah.
hold on to it. If it goes up, it goes up. It's like anything else. Well, I bought silver coins hoping they'd go from 9 to whatever it is. Now silver, as you know, is like $80 to $100. I mean,
Yeah. It's looking good.
I had gold, a little bit of gold. I had a gold ring that I recently sold, the only thing gold. And for 15 or 20 years, all the places I went to gold, this is a long, 20 years ago, gold is going to $10,000. This is like 20 years ago. Never got beyond, it got to 2,000. Everybody said, wow. It finally got 2,000. Now it's 5,000 plus.
Yeah.
And the thing is, this situation, if you actually looked at this from an economic standpoint rather than a military thing, is oil has just gone way up. We got the guy from Venezuela. We want Cuba. We're going to try and take over Cuba. Who's our Secretary of State and our National Security Advisor? Marco Rubio, who might be the next president if it's not Trump for a third term. Right now,
Or
if you're a
Vance
betting person,
or
right?
Newsom.
Well, no, I mean, from a Republican standpoint, because they still have the
Right.
votes, you got J.D. Vance, but he's young. He's like 41, 42. Okay. He was look, all of these Republicans originally were like, I don't, Trump is, I don't like him. But that's because Trump was an outlier. He wasn't a Republican. He had actually been more of a Democrat. I mean, had supported Hillary Clinton. If you just look at the history, but he wasn't a politician. You know what I mean? We have a person who's president who wasn't a politician who decided, I'm going to be in the Republican primaries. So he's now head of the Republican Party and has all of this power. But it's not like he was a Republican. I mean, Reagan was a New Deal Democrat. He was an FDR supporter. He went across. And by the way, Winston Churchill, who I know is a hero of Trump, kept shifting parties between labor and conservative. And that was one of the reasons why, like, for instance, a lot of people in England didn't like him because, like, he went with the flow. He was, like, in many ways, a transactional person. You see what I mean? He understood the shifting kind of things. He was a Sagittarius sun sign, and Trump is a Gemini sun sign, and Donald Trump is a Sagittarian moon. But here's the fact that I want to make sure I get out. When Donald Trump was born on June 14th, which was Flag Day of 1946, part of the reason he's so substantial and why, like, he's become president, the Donald, the casinos, New York, lifestyles of the rich and famous, all the controversies, is that he was born at a total solar eclipse. A total lunar eclipse on the day he was born. But 2 weeks before his birth, he had, just like we had on February 17th, this like annular eclipse, the new moon before Donald Trump's birth in 1946 was also a solar eclipse. And on the day he was born, it was a total lunar eclipse. And the blood moon was a total lunar eclipse. The difference is he and Netanyahu started this war on February 28th. You see what I mean? 4 days before the total lunar eclipse. Had he started this thing on March 3rd, which is the date we started with, which is so significant, that would have been completely in sync with his birth energy to a T. So what I've watched with him, I mean, I'm just saying, I'm not saying this is going to be a disaster, but this didn't start at the appropriate time for him. A couple of, let's see, something happened a few weeks ago. Oh no, I know what it was. It was Maduro. Okay. When they got him, right? When they got Maduro from Venezuela, where they snatched him from his palace, you know what I mean? Flew him on the plane, right? That, one of the things that happened with that was that happened on the day of a full moon. And that is not like when Osama bin Laden was captured. It's the dark of the moon just before a new moon, because this is still the case. When you do a military operation in the middle of the night, you do not want a full moon. Why? Because you don't want the people that you're trying to extract from to see what you're doing, to fire against the helicopters or something. So the whole thing with Osama bin Laden in the military was done deliberately in the dark of the moon, when that was the night that President Obama and Hillary and all of them were in that room. Part of the reason Obama went for it was the military saying, well, Mr. President, there's not going to be any moon, so we can get those helicopters in, and with surprise and the dark of the moon, basically, hopefully they won't be expecting us. What happened with the Maduro thing was they had to change the plan, because the thing was is that he wasn't, the day that he was supposed to do it, they couldn't do it. So when they got Maduro, and they had to sort of improvise, and they got him from his palace, and some people were killed, they got him and his wife, and they flew him off back to the United States and to Manhattan, where the guy's in jail now, and some Manhattan, the same place where I think Epstein died is where Maduro is, if I'm not mistaken, possibly that same place. At any rate, the thing is that a commentator in Washington was asked, what is the most surprising thing to you about the fact that it was a full moon when they got Maduro? And her answer was exactly what I'm saying to you. Is like, she said, what's shocking to me is that our military, and she pointed out about getting Osama bin Laden, we don't go around snatching people on the day of a full moon, because the moon is full. You see what I mean? That's light. And that's a very bright light. If for the defenses in Venezuela, if you're trying to go in with a helicopter, whatever it is,
or night vision, as an example.
Right. So, but what's interesting about this to everybody, our military and militaries around the planet, China, India, everybody, they're doing these missions based on astrology and moon phases. You see what I mean? They don't tell anybody. But basically, if you see these things in the future, so now the thing about pulverizing Iran, and with the Secretary of Defense, one of the things he just said, which is really interesting, is the Secretary of Defense or of War just said, one of the reasons we're going to keep doing it now is we have complete air superiority over Tehran. You see what I mean? And now Israel is trying to do that with Beirut, which is where Hezbollah is. So what they're doing is, and they've already worked with Hamas, which was Gaza. You know what I mean? Right now, you're not hearing anything about Gaza. You know what I mean? That was already for the last 2 years. All these people displaced, poor, whatever it is. But, and terrible kind of stuff there, where our president is saying, well, we could build hotels, we could rebuild all the stuff. The same thing of what's happening now. The problem, I think, that in any kind of regime change and trying to tell people, on the other side of the planet, here's what we're going to do for you. You know what I mean? There's 90 million Iranians, and you're not going to have 90 million Iranians all saying thank you to any West, to Netanyahu or Trump or anybody else. You're going to have a split, and that's why a lot of the reporters are saying, look, this is a very dangerous thing. Other countries are getting involved. You know, the Iranians are fighting back, and we don't know what's going to happen. And uncertainty is what makes the stock markets, you know what I mean? So that WIX, whatever that thing is, you know, the volatility index, right? This is where there's going to be a lot of money won and lost and, you know, betting on stuff. And now you can bet on sports. Not only sports, but you can bet on like who the next president of Iran is going to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can bet on anything.
Yeah. That's kind of cool. I like that. I like
Well, you know, and
Yeah,
now, you know, like it or not, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, who has a very powerful chart, she's a Sagittarian, and went somewhat overboard, you know, which Sagittarians tend to do. And she said something, and Trump didn't like it. And, you know, look, Trump's tagline, like he did in the first administration, was from the Celebrity Apprentice and the Apprentice was "You're fired." And the reason why that line is very powerful for large numbers of people, you don't have to do MAG or whatever it is, we all want to fight back. You know what I mean? From you know, the man, that used to be the term. You know what I mean? The government. You know what I mean? Like I said before, the Jesse Jameses. You know, you have a farm, you have a homestead in the middle of Kansas or wherever it is, and the transatlantic railroad, while all these Eastern power people are coming in and saying, "We'll give you like $50, but you got to be out." You know what I mean? We don't care. You know, we'll just give you a little bit of this money. It's not like they gave people a lot of money. You know what I mean? Now, there were things like the homesteading thing in Oklahoma. There were places, you know, people would go out there to get, you know, their life in Oklahoma and different places. But if you had been a pioneer, you know, and the railroad was suddenly coming through, that's why we get these things about Jesse James and other people, you know what I mean, who were basically people who were sort of fighting for, you know, they went overboard, but, you know, that movie with John Dillinger with what's his name, Johnny Depp, starred in that. I don't know if you saw that a number of years ago. You know, bringing back John Dillinger and all these criminals, you know, from the time period of the 30s, you know, and so on. There's a love affair in our country with, you know, some of these criminal figures. And again, we had that in the movies, Edward G. Robinson, James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, you know, these film noir kind of things of these characters, you know, part of bootlegging, because it was all like, hey, government, don't tell us we can't drink alcohol. Don't tell us that we can't elect a president for more than 2 terms. You know what I mean? The country is founded on revolution.
And on that note, revolution. Viva la Mexico. That's what I'm thinking of.
Well,
just joking, just playing around. But,
no, I know we got to go. I know it's a long time, but
this has been awesome, Mark. This has been absolutely amazing. I'd love to have you back. And folks, you definitely want to check out Mark's website. He's been doing this for over 40 years. He does awesome readings. He does individual readings. You can also go to the website and they have like generic readings.
There's reports in plain English, computerized reports that are less expensive and still give you, you know, your cycles, transits, progressions, your natal interpretation. We've got 20 of those is 50% off. And yeah, and subscribing to the Cosmic Calendar. Yeah, visit iconicastrology.com. And the Cosmic Calendar's on there. There's a lot of freebies. And on my Great Bear website, there's also, I did over 100 podcasts, you know, since 2019 that you can listen to, you know, 40 minutes, 50 minutes on almost every subject. Yeah, on there, there's I think if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see, go back up for a second. Okay, stop. Astroscope podcast. All of that are over 120 to listen to, all free, you know, of different subjects with different charts and all this stuff. You know, I just did one, you know, having to do with a coast to coast, remember Art Bell and who passed away and stuff like that. But, you know, fundamentally, those are all free, and there's over 120 of them. And if you go back for one sec, oh yeah, there we go. My inner child cards. And my school, if you want to learn astrology, it used to be $750 for 36 1-hour lessons. Now it's $199. I mean, I have to go with the shift. You know, a lot of people can't afford stuff like they did. You know, but we've automated and made everything a whole lot easier. Like with classes, they used to be remember cassette tapes? So I had my classes on cassette tapes that we'd have to create them and send them, and it was $750 And then they became CDs. My daughter, who does a lot of my work, made them CDs. And now you just go online and you join the school for $199. And we basically say, okay, go in there. And then you go at your own pace, 1 hour lesson, audio lesson. And then you have all of these lesson notes extra and then charts. And you just go at your own pace. Literally 36 1 hour kind of things. You get beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And it's like the bargain of the century. Literally, it's $199 for 36 classes is like $5 for each lesson that will blow you away. You know, an hour to hear about like the zodiac, the planets, the houses. And I use John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe and a lot of other people, you know, major people to understand in those beginner, intermediate, advanced. So yeah, you know, go around there, get reports, listen, do things for free. You know, thank you very much for letting people know. And I did create 2 different co-create inner child cards with my ex-wife Isha Lerner, which is unbelievable. It's been translated into like 13 languages. It sold over 100,000 decks. And I love your deck, you know, so much. We've done so much with those cards. And then I also did baseball tarot with another 2 people. And unfortunately, I only have 4 of those left, and you can't find baseball tarot out in public because the sad thing is there was either a fire in Wisconsin or, without telling us, they basically lost 15,000 copies of baseball tarot. And baseball tarot with 78 cards is fantastic, but it's like you can't buy it. But I do still have 4 copies. I think we're selling them for like $60 each, baseball tarot. It would be shipped to people by priority mail in a padded envelope. There's a lot of stuff there, and I really appreciate your opportunity, like, to talk about this stuff. But my main thing is educating people about real astrology. You know, who you are, who your loved ones are, learning about that with all these different techniques, and also knowing who our leaders are, you know, what's happening in the world. I would like to share more when we get you know, at some point, about the disclosure stuff. This is going to be a very interesting year with this movie that's already going to come out, and you can go on to International Movie Database and other things. You can see several different snippets of Steven Spielberg's movie called Disclosure Day. It has Emily Blunt. It has a number of, you know, and it's happening at the right time. And it's within 2 days of Donald Trump's birthday, and he keeps saying we're gonna get the facts out to the American people. Remember that stuff in New Jersey last year?
Oh yeah.
You know, and all these other ones, and we've talked about it. And flying saucers, Kenneth Arnold, what happened, you know, 9 flying discs, and Roswell. All of these things have happened, and all around the world, and we just can't keep saying it isn't real. All those Navy you know, those guys saying, did you see that thing, you know, from the aircraft carrier in 2002 that there was released through the New York Times, you know, several years ago?
Oh
I mean,
yeah.
how long are we going to say this isn't true?
Well, on that note, I think we'll say, is it not true, or is it ours? Is it some secret government programs? I want to believe more than you know.
But,
Trust me.
but
I want to believe. But
I
anyway.
love you, brother, and thank you so much for all of the things. You know, we're part of the bear totem, and the
Yes.
great bear that is my logo of the 7 stars. You know, that is a beautiful kind of constellation. At the end of the reason that happened was at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. When I was in Findhorn in Scotland, I came home. This is when I met a person who became my wife, and, you know, eventually came back to the States. But that was in your year, in 1977, in May. Star Wars came out. The world was changed with science fiction. In October, Close Encounters played in one theater in Manhattan. And a lot of people came in, and I saw that movie several times. Near the end of the movie, the main star, I always forget his name, he's in Devil's Tower. You remember where we're at?
Oh yeah,
And
Wyoming. Been there. Yeah.
right.
Awesome.
And the UFOs make the Great Bear, the 7 stars of the Great Bear, they line up. And he laughs because he's about to go onto the thing and go into the spacecraft. Now I've ruined it for anybody who hasn't seen it on Devil's Tower. But they make the UFOs make it look like we're the Great Bear, the 7 stars. And from that's why my business, I chose that, because I love Close Encounters. I love Star Wars, But see, Lucas and Spielberg changed the world with science fiction, and they were best friends. And 1977 was the year. And that's when Chiron was discovered, and all these political changes. Anwar Sadat from Egypt went to Israel and spoke in the Knesset. Eventually, he lost his life. And we're still allied with Egypt since 1977, and so on from when Jimmy Carter became president. He had a Camp David Accord where he got the leaders of Israel and Egypt to align. We're still having that alliance. The United States and Egypt have not broken their alliance since Jimmy Carter was president. You know what I mean? We've not had falling out.
That's what the Stargates are, Mark. They can't break an alliance.
This is the pyramid, the Sphinx, all
right.
of this other stuff, all Karnak, the Israelites leaving the 10 Commandments, 40 years in the desert, all kind, manna from heaven, which was also Manuel Velikovsky. Venus and Mars were moving. Einstein liked Velikovsky. They were friends. Space-time continuum.
The original. That, like, Egypt is the original capital of the planet.
And by the way, I know we have to stop, but the original astrology, okay, here's my final comment. Why does the sun only rule Leo and not another sign? Why does the moon only rule Cancer? Why does Mercury rule Gemini and Virgo? Why does Venus rule Taurus and Libra? Why does Mars traditionally rule Aries and Scorpio? Why did traditionally Jupiter rule Sagittarius and Pisces, and Saturn used to rule two signs, Aquarius and Capricorn? It goes back to ancient Egypt and only ancient Egypt, because their zodiac was when the Nile River overflowed, because they had the star Sirius, which was the brightest star, and the Nile River would overflow in the summer. And that's when our sun and the star Sirius would align. The astrology that we use beyond Greece and Rome goes back to Egypt. The rulerships of the planets. Egypt, like you just said, with the pyramids, UFOs, the whole thing with Orion, the alignment of the three pyramids that we figured out connected to Orion, and all that. This is where we all were, if we accept reincarnation, which I do. You and I were hanging out there. Hey, how's the building of the third pyramid going? What do you think about those UFOs recently? And all these books that the pyramids were not tombs. They were these are sources of electricity. And it's just amazing to me. You probably had people on that the original pyramids had this coating, and the top had a little pyramid, and it would have been amazing. And this is connected back to Tesla and so on, the whole magic of electricity and natural forms of energy from the earth in pyramidal form, because they're pyramids in Central America. They were built all over the planet. We didn't know that. And they were basically electronic or high-tech things. And this was Tesla's thing, pretty much. You know what I mean? About natural earth energy and what he was experimenting. And again, he had a terrible end. But yeah.
Christopher Dunn wrote the Giza power plant is what you're, I think.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So, but the thing is, my feeling is, and I know I gave a talk last year, and a guy who's working on disclosure in Washington, D.C., he spent his whole life since 1995, and there have been so many congressional things. I think that possibly, this is my hope, that this stuff with the bombing and everything, and horrible loss of life, there is some kind of level of, let me make this as my final statement. Steven Spielberg is in turn 80. Why is he back to doing a science fiction movie like Close Encounters and E.T.? He's done all these other things, a lot of creative things, that have nothing to do with this, but this could be one of his last films. And I think it's going to be a remarkable movie. It's coming out on a Friday night in June. It's a very powerful weekend. And I think that what's going to happen is that the antidote for what we're seeing now, and this is my hope, it's not a prediction, is that finally the world needs to accept that whoever or whatever these entities and beings are, we had to prevent this, and there are reasons. We didn't want the public and America and Russia and all these other countries. But, now we have to, get the truth of that out there. And this is the key person, Donald Trump and his administration, because he is an outsider. He's not allied with the power brokers of the Democrats or Republicans, either one, to say, look, let's release these files. Let the American public know what's going on, finally.
I sure hope so. But I'm optimistic. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm optimistic.
Unless Spielberg's movie doesn't come out. But the point is, June 12th, everybody, that is already scheduled to come out in all these movies. It's a month before, 4 weeks before July 4th. It's 2 days before Donald Trump's birthday. There's going to be all these festivities in Washington. And Donald Trump has said several times in the last 2 weeks, before all this stuff happened about Iran. But the question is, could this elimination of the fear thing, as terrible as it's seeming to be with deaths and all these explosions and losses of life, what if all of this is moving toward disclosure? So that is that look, whatever alien presence is or whatever has happened over the centuries, we don't know. Watch your Cowboys and Aliens movie again with Harrison Ford and Daniel Craig. You want to see something that's really interesting about gold? You know that movie? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know the
Cowboys
movie.
and Aliens.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Watch that, folks. Keep your eye on that if you've never seen it, and then think about disclosure.
All right.
Okay, we're going to go forward here. Love and blessings, everybody. Thank you from my heart to yours that you have me on. And folks, I just want to say Rex and I sort of came together kind of in the last 24 hours. And this isn't the way, sometimes we've done this. I feel very grateful. And, we plan this in advance. Like, hey, in a week, do you want to do this? And then we figure out, is this a good time? This is such an urgent time with, like, right now, I don't know what's been happening over there, and I'm eager to find out. I don't want little girls in a facility. This happened also with Saddam Hussein, where he put a bunch of people into a facility. We thought that it was a bad, place of weapons, and we obliterated it, in one bomb. And it turned out that supposedly there were like 300 women and children. And Saddam Hussein was not above. I mean, he was basically a very diabolical figure when we found out the kind of person he really was. What
You're
happened.
Talking about the school that got hit in Iran?
Well, I'm talking about I'm talking about
That's you first brought up, right?
What just happened, if that's true.
Yeah.
But during Saddam Hussein, when we were fighting him, see, we hit part of the thing was we were showing on TV the advances that of the Pentagon, and so they hit a building that supposedly had weapons. You see, or some kind of thing, and then whether true or not, over several days, the Iraqi government said, no, there were women and children in there. And that could have been because, see, what Saddam Hussein, anybody can just put a whole bunch of people in a building, then they get killed, right? And then it looks like America is like committing a war crime because we didn't know.
Terrible. Yeah, it's terrible for the media. I get it. They're
on the minds. I don't know what happened. I don't know if that's a true thing, but I remember they showed it on TV to show how, wow, look at what our plane did. We took out this terrible building that Saddam was hiding a lot of things. Then 2 days later, wait a minute, he said he put women and children. Was that a lie? We don't know. I don't know what the facts were, if anybody could figure that out. And that's part of the thing is, did those little girls die? And look, I don't think we deliberately did it. It was an accident. But the question is, did we actually wind up killing a whole bunch of innocent, girls in a school because a bomb went off kilter? These things happen. And we could just say, we're so sorry that it happened. But if it did happen, that's a horrific loss of life. That's just a horrific loss of life. And it's not as if it did anything about a nuclear weapon or anything about the Iranian government. It was just an accident because we're bombing a lot of places and somebody hit a school by accident.
It's horrific, man. War sucks.
I know.
War sucks.
Our country has been fairly fortunate, except we had 9/11, we had the Pearl Harbor, we had different things that have happened. We had the Spanish-American War, we had the Civil War, all these different
war.
Things. Yeah. And again, we need, whether it's prayers or affirmations or positive thoughts, there is this backlash, a boomerang to any of these things. And we have to just be hopeful that we don't, like what happened in Austin, Texas, this person recently, did that person get angry? You know, somebody, there was we call it an incident, but there was a crime just like 3 days
Some people
ago.
think it was a sleeper cell. Who really knows what? I mean, we don't know. You know,
No, we don't know. And that's the thing is, it's going to become very hard to get all these facts. But I know we got to go, and like, well, I guess just keep in touch with me, and I'm ready at any time. And hopefully we won't have to come back real soon, that cooler heads will prevail. That was part of the movie 13 Days and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, we could have lost everything in October of '62 between Kennedy and Khrushchev and Fidel Castro. That was the closest we came to World War III. You know what I mean? Back in before you were born, when I was 12 years old, and you know, the Russians had put nuclear weapons or atomic weapons into Cuba, and we didn't know, and we had to get them out.
Yep.
So let's just, you know, now everything is a different playing field. So thank you, everybody. Everybody have a good weekend. Let's pray for peace and love and harmony, and think good thoughts. And hopefully, I mean, there's only limited numbers of things we can do. People can rally, you can study, you can learn your esoteric stuff, get into astrology and these subject matters and UFOs, and keep getting more knowledgeable and wise.
Right on. Well, Mark, once again, brother, very nice to talk with you. Next time, hopefully it'll be on the UFO disclosure, unless we have an emergency meeting we need to do. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. I hope you have a beautiful day. Be prepared, not scared. Be kind, rewind, and be the change you want to see. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.